Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Oh, it's not only morning if you're in the US. Afternoon, evening to everyone else. Lovely to see you. I'm Lee Hamilton. I'm a former board member for BN, and I'm located in the US. I'm here to chair this session on politics of basic income. I'm going to turn it first to Liz Fouksman. Do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, let me see if I can get my slides up. All right, can you see it in full screen? Great.
Yep,
okay.
I see you.
Brilliant. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here, especially those of you that I know are probably, it's probably very, very early for you. I'm in London at the moment, so it's 10:30, a perfectly reasonable time to give a presentation. So I'm Liz Fouksman. I'm an assistant professor at King's College London, and this is co-authored work that I'll be talking about today, primarily with my co-author William Monteith, who's at Queen Mary University of London, but also with Olivia Vicol and Anna Maria Cristia, who also contributed to this paper. Right. So mostly I work as a kind of empirical social scientist and economic anthropologist on questions of work and basic income in South Africa and Namibia. So this paper is a little bit of a departure for me. But this paper is based on empirical research we did during the COVID pandemic when I couldn't really go to South Africa to do the usual research that I would do. And it focuses on moral perspectives on work and on redistribution, including basic income, among Eastern European migrant workers in London. Let me just see if my slides are, there we go. And what we wanted to do with this research is try to understand how precariously employed people, and in particular migrants in London, imagine the relationship between work and deservingness and redistribution, again, including radical redistributory ideas like basic income in the wake of the COVID pandemic. And we did the empirical part of this research kind of at the tail end of 2001. And we wanted to ask how the pandemic and associated forms of redistribution that happened during it. So in the UK, this was a kind of more generous form of what's here called universal credit, kind of social welfare, social security, and various furlough schemes, how these kind of new forms of social protection and redistribution challenged or consolidated moral attitudes towards work and broadening forms of welfare. And we also were interested in trying to figure out whether we could identify kind of generative signs and seeds within our interviews of kind of more utopian future possibilities for things like welfare. Right, so in order to do that, we wanted to put two literatures into conversation. And because there's not a lot of time, I'm not going to go really kind of into a lot of depth with the literature review here, but both Will and myself are really interested in kind of the literature around post-work, which aims to decenter work within our imaginations of a just and inclusive economic future, usually with the help of something like a universal basic income. But post-work literatures tend to be very focused on theory, when they do kind of engage with empirics, it tends to be focused on white-collar workers in rich countries in the global north. So there's a kind of lack of attention, we think, towards empirics, towards moral attitudes, towards work and redistribution amongst people, and also towards questions like race and class and migration. And what we wanted to do is kind of bring a focus on empirics to this literature. And we wanted to ask how post-work ideas are encountered and perceived on the ground, and how they rub up against pre-existing moral attitudes and attachments to work and redistribution. And then how these attitudes intersect with broader questions of race and class and migration. So we wanted to bring the post-work literature into conversation with the literature on work, welfare, and migration. And again, I don't have time to kind of go into a lot of details here, and it's a really big body of work, but what I want to emphasize is there's a kind of paradox of the migrant work ethic, where on the one hand, migrants are accused of taking advantage of welfare, of being lazy, of having an underdeveloped work ethic, of being scroungers, of being overly reliant on kind of host welfare states. And on the other hand, paradoxically, migrants are also accused at the same time of having an overdeveloped work ethic, of self-exploitation, of taking jobs away from more kind of deserving citizens. So there's kind of a lot of interesting literature around this, but there's less attention that's been paid on the way migrants themselves kind of experience and make sense of this paradox. But there is a little bit out there on that. And this is what we kind of wanted to focus on. And I want to emphasize, before I kind of get into our empirical data, I want to emphasize two concepts that we found really useful in doing this research. So migrants kind of demonstrate their deservingness through a combination of role embracement and associational distancing. So role embracement is a kind of reproduction of the idea of the good worker, the good taxpayer, the good citizen, through stated preferences for conditionality of welfare predicated on contributions through hard work, through payment of taxes, and through law abidance. And this is something that will definitely come up in our interviews once I get into them. At the same time, associational distancing kind of distinguishes oneself from others who are undeserving. And this often includes a kind of racialized imagination of the welfare cheat. And this is what some theorists call the dirty work of boundary maintenance, right? So you become the good migrant, but there's also sort of the bad migrant or the bad welfare recipient. And again, this also, as you'll see, really comes up in our empirical work. So having kind of set the scene, just briefly on our method. So this work is based on 26 interviews with Romanian, Moldovan, Latvian, and Ukrainian migrant workers, kind of more or less evenly split between men and women. Our participants engaged in various precarious forms of work, such as construction, cleaning, hospitality industries. 19 of them experienced some periods of worklessness during the COVID pandemic, and quite a few of them had some kind of experience with the UK welfare state through furlough or through the self-employed income support scheme or through universal credit, despite a lot of barriers put up by the UK state for migrants receiving these kind of benefits. So in our interviews, we really tried to get at a kind of utopian post-work provocation. We wanted to ask people, what do you think of something like a universal unconditional income guarantee or a basic income? And we tried to attack this from different angles. So we kind of asked straight on what people thought of a UBI. We also asked people whether state-funded payments should have conditions, and if so, what kind. We asked people what effect they thought a UBI would have on society. And then we kind of changed gears and asked people, kind of without naming basic income, we just asked people, what would you personally do if your income was taken care of, if you didn't have to worry about money? And we also asked about taxing the rich. So how should such a scheme be funded, and would higher taxation on the rich be good? So our responses, the responses we heard were really rich, were really plural, were often contradictory. So some people were in favor of a UBI, some were against, some kind of changed their minds halfway through the conversation. Almost everyone, though, was really skeptical of unconditionality and universality, especially unconditionality. A lot of people insisted that economic security cannot be divorced from work. And I'm going to tease out some of the core themes that emerge through two kind of long, detailed responses that I'll present as two vignettes. And just to say quickly that there are some racist tropes and views that come up in these quotes, so just kind of prepare yourself for that. So this is a quote from Dimitri, who's a 47-year-old construction worker from Moldova. And just this Right, there we go. And he said, when we asked him about basic income, he said, doing nothing and getting money, I don't think that's fair. I could have said that I don't want to go and just stayed home. I could have given a reason that I can't go to work as I need to stay home because my daughter is sick. But no, I wanted to prove to them that I wanted to go to work. If someone doesn't contribute anything, they shouldn't receive anything. And then he goes on to say, I see people of Roma ethnicity who get divorced just so they can receive more benefits, and they build palaces back home, and they just make kids. And he kind of goes on to talk about people having kids so they can receive benefits. And he says, Romanians and Polish people in other countries, they just focus on this. They can come here and make kids and they will get benefits. It should be stopped. And then he goes on to say they can sweep or clean or wash the buses. They can do anything. Washing the streets and disinfecting, there's lots of things available. So that's Dimitri. And then one more quote I want to share with you, which is from Maria, who's a cleaner from Romania, who's 56, who says, people need to be responsible too and go to work too. You can't just wait and do nothing. For example, I have a colored lady who lives here. She receives a benefit, she doesn't work anywhere, and she sits all day long. Not even the stairs, she doesn't clean them. Not even now when she saw me cleaning, I don't argue with her, I just do it myself. She could do things, sweep in the park or something, but maybe not for 8 hours, but for 4 hours with someone watching. If the state pays her rent and also gives her money, and she kind of goes on to say, she won't do anything because she gets welfare benefits. And actually then, this is a small part of a very long quote where she actually goes on to say, I don't want to say racist things, but, and then goes on to say quite racist things about Roma families who abuse housing benefits. So there's a few themes I want to tease out of these kind of two vignettes, two quotes. And the kind of first key theme that I want to pull out is this idea of fairness and deservingness. So there's a kind of refusal going on here of our utopian provocation, insistence on remaining in the register of the capitalist work ethic, of a kind of workerist moral discourse. And there's a real emphasis on justice and fairness. Fairness comes up a lot in these interviews, of seeing work as a contribution, and economic security is something that's deserved, not something that can be claimed. So again, Dimitri's saying, doing nothing and getting money, I don't think it's fair. It's not fair to sit and do nothing and someone else pays. And same with Maria, who says you can't just wait and do nothing. So then the other key theme that I want to pull out is this sort of role embracement that I was talking about earlier, the role embracement of the hardworking migrants, of the hardworking self, and then this associational distancing of the lazy other. So you have this idea of the hardworking migrant, of Dimitri saying, I have to work so I can contribute, of Maria saying, I don't argue, I just wash the stairs. So in the self, hard work is this moral character. And then this kind of use of racist tropes to create associational distancing towards other groups of migrants, in particular the Roma, which came up a lot in our interviews, but also from Dimitri, who's Moldovan. He talks about Romanians and Polish people as well, and then also locals and British people, but very much kind of, again, intersecting with racist tropes towards people of color. So in all of these, laziness becomes this kind of key character flaw. So you have these lazy locals versus hardworking migrants. And in these lazy others, hard work needs to be forced through economic necessity. And we saw this a lot in other quotes as well. We have this other quote about someone telling us that, no one would get up at 5 a.m. to go to work if they weren't forced to. Like if the state gave them money, then, where would we be? But there's a kind of third contradictory theme that I want to tease out, which is around work and care. So it seems through these quotes that, for instance, raising children, caring for children is not work. So again, Dimitri says, I need to stay home because my daughter is sick, but no, I want to prove to them that I want to go to work, right? So staying home to care for his sick daughter wouldn't prove to this mysterious them that he never names that Dimitri is a hardworking migrant. And then he goes on to talk about how people have children to receive welfare benefits, again, very much seeing caring for children as not work. So work seems to mean leaving the home, being outside the private realm, whereas staying in the home is characterized as sitting or waiting. So this conception of work is both kind of masculinist and ableist. So work becomes a kind of public disciplining. And the other interesting kind of contradictory piece of this, though, is that maintenance of public space came up a lot in these interviews too, and was seen very much as work that was always available. So people can wash buses, they can clean the stairs. So these raises questions about what is care, what counts or doesn't count as work, and what is valued and how. But just to kind of finish up, I will say that we did manage to get at some fragments of a post-work utopia in some of our interviews. And that's when we asked people to imagine themselves personally in a world where kind of their economic necessity or their income was taken care of. And that's when people became willing to go into this kind of post-work utopian place where people talked about building a cabin in the forest, going out into nature, visiting beautiful places, but they also really forefronted care of others. So people talked about, you know, if they didn't have to worry about their economic security, then I would give, they talked about how they would give money to foster homes, to distressed people, or they talked about hiring other people or helping other people who are struggling, adjusting to life in the UK. So in this kind of post-economically secure world, voluntary acts of care become really central, which we thought was really interesting, kind of in contradiction to the previous devaluing of care that we heard in our interviews. So to conclude, we kind of have this complex, entangled, contradictory set of views of value and work and care and deservingness. There's this sort of weird contradiction of care within and beyond the home, the way it's devalued within the home, but then becomes valued in this utopian mode outside of the home. But what we've thought was particularly interesting is the kind of value of this utopian provocation of the way people are skeptical of others, but then when imagining the future self, people are willing to kind of move beyond these fears of lazy migrants and job-stealing migrants and this kind of valorization of the work ethic towards a richer tapestry of care and meaningful activity. So I'm going to end there, and thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much. I think at this point, we will turn the floor to Franziska Gassmann.
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, thank you all very much. So our paper actually goes to South Africa. It's very interesting to hear that Liz just referred to that her previous work was a lot on South Africa. Again, this is also joint work together with Esther Schuring and Brian Matebula from the University of Applied Science in Bonn. Now, what we wanted to look at, so it is about the framing, whether, let's say, the framing of universal basic income actually matters and to what extent, let's say, design option matters. And this is partly motivated, obviously, on the one hand, as I will come back to it later, by the experiences of South Africa, as there is the UBIC on part of the political discussion, but also based on the literature where we see there is a lot of literature on universal basic income, but there is very little about, let's say, the impact of different design modalities of universal basic income on support levels and how it affects the preferences for a universal basic income. So what you also see is what we have learned from the literature, that yes, the preferences seem to remain stable also across different surveys, but again, we do not know how and whether, to what extent preferences can be changed, for example, with more information or with how such a universal basic income would be framed. Maybe what is also interesting to see, at least what we have seen, most of the research on the universal basic income is focused on the global north, and there is very little on the global south. There is research on the basic income, but it focuses on potential impact and fiscal implications. But the evidence on public attitudes as such is really scarce. So our question is whether and under what conditions would South Africans support the introduction of a universal basic income grant? And two specific questions: to what extent would design matter, such as conditionality or specific targeting options? And are the preferences are they robust to how the introduction, how a UBIC is actually framed? Now, in our conceptual framework, which on the one hand, on the right-hand side, is a lot of text, don't bother reading, but it is just some of the pre-existing literature on a universal basic income, which is rather wide, because we think about what determines the preferences or support for a basic income. Obviously, self-interest is something that has been identified to matter. So if I'm poor, most probably I'm more likely also to be in favor of universal basic income. The performance of the existing system, this is definitely relevant if you think about the studies in the global north, and all the different, most of the experiments took place in countries that do already have welfare state systems. And one of the questions is, for example, what would then be replaced? Is a universal basic income in addition of the existing system, or would it replace? And are people actually happy with what they have right now? Another important line of arguments relates to the attitudes towards poverty. If I think that the poor are poor because they are lazy, most probably I'm much less likely to support any kind of social protection measures towards the poor, but also that would also refer to universal basic income. And another important concern is obviously the cost implications and how such a system could be funded. Now, our case study, we think that South Africa is a really interesting case because the UBIC has been on the political agenda and also has been considered financially feasible. And if you look at that, I mean, this is also a discussion which has been going on for more than 20 years. But so far, there was no real political take-up. On the other hand, South Africa still has very high levels of poverty and high levels of inequality, across different population groups. And so it would be important to understand who are the supporters of the transfer schemes, and how can also support be garnered, let's say, for a more universal basic income. Now, we collected primary data in and around the city of Johannesburg. So you already see, so our findings are obviously not representative for the entire of South Africa. And the data were collected in the end of spring 2021, after the COVID lockdown was actually removed. So people came out of COVID, which I also think makes it interesting because they have just experienced this covariate crisis affecting many of them. So we try to obviously have our sample as close to a stratified, let's say, the population of the city of Johannesburg when it comes to sex and age, and we only sampled working age respondents. In total, we had slightly more than 1,300 questionnaires that were completed. And as you can see in the table below, was about half of them were women. Most of them were actually South African citizens. About a third could be considered to have low education. Slightly more than half had a job, was employed. And again, about 60% had children in the household. Now, what we do, on the one hand, we wanted to really empirically analyze the type of support. And here you see, the question how it comes from the survey, where we ask, there are various design options for a universal basic income grant. To what extent would you support, on a scale from 1 to 5, the introduction of this basic income grant if, and then we have A, B, C, D, and E. Now, this is the basis as you will see later, for our dependent variable. Our core independent variables are, let's say, determinants of support, the O need, when the people are poor, whether our respondents think that the existing social protection grant system in South Africa, which is substantial, definitely for a sub-Saharan African country, whether it's considered to be fair. We look at the attitudes towards the poor, whether people actually think that these grants make people lazy, and also have some questions about the cost considerations, that's whether or not the current system costs the taxpayer too much money. And our second method, we introduced a survey experiment to test the impact of a particular framing of universal basic income. So in our treatment group, they were shown a short video on which, on the one hand, really showed the necessity for South Africa to do something in order to overcome poverty and reduce inequality and unemployment. And they were also then told about what the UBIC is and what it could do. Our control group only received a short definition of what universal basic income is. You can also see, so we have randomly allocated the experiment and our groups are pretty nicely balanced. Now, if we look at whether design matters, this is just as a start. What you have on the one hand here, so if we just ask, would you be in support irrespective of age, 60% of our respondents were in support. However, when we then accounted for the question about whether they, if it is conditional or on tied to behavioral conditions, and then we see, so if there is no conditionality, our support actually goes down to 80%. In a way, this also relates to what Liz just mentioned from her qualitative survey in London. Now, if we look at the role of targeting, what we have, so these what we call the pure support is, let's say, 17.7%, which we would say this is what is considered to be a universal basic income allocated irrespective of age and without any conditionality. So if we then ask about different targeting, whether it should be targeted to specific groups and whether this changes support levels, we only see increases if we talk about unemployed and the poor. Now, going back to our pure, let's say, version of universal basic income, what we see here is in our, let's say, a regression analysis on the one hand, so it is very clear all needs is positively associated, let's say, with support for a pure universal basic income. On the other hand, our other three, let's say, core independent variables, fairness, laziness, cost implications, are all negatively associated with the support for a pure universal basic income. So actually, people would think that the current grants are fair, are less likely to be in favor of this universal basic income. Now, then we look at who actually changes how do the changes opinions, because we also want to analyze what are the potential drivers for this change in opinions, right? So how do you read this table? You start from the very left. So we have, let's say, for our pure universal basic income, we had 18% in support and 82% no support. And then we look at whether they would switch to support. So if we introduce conditionality, so we see that support would increase. These are relative numbers with 73%. If it would be targeted to children, an increase of 6%. If we also increase the condition, 71%. So you also see that the support increases if it is targeted to specific target group, but to those vulnerable groups. And the biggest increase in support is if there is also a link to behavioral conditions, which would be tied to the receipt of this income grant. When we look at the, the drivers, I'm so sorry, I just did something wrong. Anyway. So who gets more supportive in response to the design changes? We see again that the poor are less likely to change their view if we introduce conditionality, while the opposite is the case if we look at if you consider grants are fair, you are actually more likely to become positive if if conditionalities are actually introduced. If you think the grants costs too much, the same applies. And if we then, on the other hand, our signs are exactly opposite when we talk about the targeted to the unemployed or targeted to the poor, those that are currently poor are also very much, let's say, supportive, or that they're more likely to become supportive, indeed, if these income, universal basic income, essentially, I think you cannot talk anymore about the universal basic income if it is targeted to the poor. But that's not the question here right now. So we see how these changes actually operate. Now, our final, let's say in our second part, we analyze our preferences robust to framing. So where we look then what is the impact of our survey experiment. And if you look just, there's a lot of information on this slide, but there are only a few cells which are marked in yellow, and these are the only instances where we would have found, let's say, a significant coefficient. So the conclusion overall is that this framing, or the framing that we have applied, did not make any difference in the responses, in the support levels for universal basic income grant, and it didn't matter which of the options that we actually show. Let's say that's really the table 1 on top, right left, which summarizes these results. But then obviously we were interested to see, so to do some heterogeneity analysis, if we now look at different groups, maybe, if we have different type of characteristics, that different groups respond differently to the framing that we have applied. Poverty status doesn't matter. Current attitude to grants doesn't matter. Whether, let's say, the application level of our respondents doesn't matter. But we also looked at, given that we look at South Africa, obviously people have heard about the universal basic income grant. So we had one question, actually also before we went into the experiment, have you heard about the universal basic income grant? And then we looked at it is about a third of our sample, a fourth of our sample, who has indeed heard of that. And that is very interesting because for me, it is also to some extent counterintuitively, yes? So that if you have heard about that, you are less likely to support, let's say, so the framing effect actually reduce the likelihood that you would be in support of a universal basic income, which is targeted to the unemployed or is targeted to the poor. So it is kind of challenging, or actually it's interesting to see these findings and try to come up with an explanation for those. Now, let me conclude. So our question was whether and under what condition would South Africans support the introduction of universal basic income grant. So the factors which are positively associated with support is clearly own need. While a positive view of the existing social transfers and a negative attitude towards transfer recipients and cost considerations are negatively associated with support. And we also clearly found design matters. Conditionality and targeting increase support levels. And own need, fairness concerns, and cost considerations are those factors which are associated with also a change in support or preferences for different options, you can say. And do the preferences remain robust to framing? Overall, yes, they do. And so let's say we only see this negative association with support for those that had a prior knowledge of the universal basic income grant. If we are right, and obviously we still need to do maybe a better search, but we think we are one of the first studies which are actually analyzing these attitudes towards universal basic income in the global south, where we use primary data and we have a survey experiment. That's it for now, and I'm also very much looking forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And next, I will turn it over to Enrico Nichelatti.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on your time zone. I'm Enrico Nichelatti, a PhD student of the University of Helsinki and a research assistant at UNU-MERIT, United Nations University based in Helsinki. Today I'm going to present a joint work with Heikki Ilamo, professor of the University of Helsinki, and Onli Kangalas, professor of the University of Turku. The title of our paper is How to Implement a Perfect Basic Income Experiment, Evidence from 4 Countries. Outlined by the presentation, I will briefly introduce motivation of study, the 4 case studies, data methods, the main findings, and also a discussion about the conclusions. About motivation, relatively scarce body of qualitative descriptions, the analyses and comparisons of planning and implementation processes of basic income experiments. Policymakers should look at what happened in our jurisdictions and consider the desirability and feasibility of undertaking a similar endeavor in their own countries. And for motivation, strong country comparison by investigating 4 different BI experiments. The analysis indeed identifies common aspects and differences among all the selected case studies in all the implementation phases. About the case study, we have 4 countries. We selected Finland, that recently developed a basic income pilot, Netherlands, Spain, the Catalonian Income Project, and Uganda with the first basic income pilot in the Guzibi village. Regarding the Finnish basic income pilot, the main goals was the primary goals expressing the government bill, and the subsequent act of the basic income experiment was to analyze if basic income is a good device to increase employment, and also should be considered the context on the Finnish basic income has been launched. It was a former government with a right stamp, and to justify the implementation of basic income, they focused on the labor supply response. And also, our goal was how to reform the Finnish social security system to better correspond to changes in working life and make it easier to take on part-time jobs. The main characteristics that their beneficiaries were unemployed adults between 15 and 63 years old, and participation was mandatory. The sample was randomized and there was national representative, and the benefit was 500-600 euros, and it was cumulative on our social transfers. And the length of the pilot was 2 years between 2017-2018, and this is a common aspect of all 4 basic income pilots, and one of the main reasons why we decided these basic income pilots. About the Dutch basic income pilot, the main goals were testing various forms of providing social assistance, shift to local social policy practices towards social investment, or capacitating approaches, and ensure more or less unconditional right to a minimum wage. Main characteristic about the Dutch basic income, or also called trust experiment, was the sample was composed by 5,000 participants, and it was the participation was voluntary. The Dutch basic income pilot as one of the biggest experiments in social security ever conducted worldwide, given the large sample. The experiment was a randomized controlled trial, and it was implemented in 6 different municipalities. We will talk about this later. And 3 types of treatment experiments in addition to the control group. So there were also some different treatment experiments. About the Spanish Catalan basic income pilot, so-called BIM income, the main goals were assessing the effectiveness and efficiency of innovative and comprehensive policy measures aimed at combating poverty and social exclusion in Barcelona-deprived urban areas, and testing which modality of income transfer is the most effective and efficient. The sample was about 1,000 households, so we are not talking about individuals here, but households. And 383 were assigned to the control group. The project's experiment model combined aspects of a saturation study with randomized control trials, so there were different methods, both quantitative and qualitative, and the experiment was divided into 4 cash modalities and 4 active policy modalities. Regarding latter, the Ugandan Basic Income Pilot developed in the Buzibi village, the main goals were reduction of extreme poverty, increase in gender equality, resilience to climate change, food security, and entrepreneurship. The main characteristics were all citizens, 146 of the Buzibi village were receiving the benefit, so the universal coverage here was respected, and the benefit was given via mobile phone. So each other was receiving a monthly payment, which accounted for roughly 30% of average income of lower income families in Uganda. And as for the others, the length of the pilot was 2 years from 2017 to 2019. So this is a summary of the case studies that is showing the length. As you can see in the left part, the length is the same for all the pilots. Universal in this case, only Uganda respects the universal aspect because other countries applied some conditions. Unconditional also, Netherlands and Spain, we can discuss about this, but did not respect entirely the unconditional aspect. And the cash-based aspect, in this case, Uganda, the pilot opted for mobile money transfer. You can see also on the right part, the benefit frequency, for example, and the coverage. So about the data methods, we use qualitative analysis to investigate the various aspects of the basic income policy chain. In this case, we were interested to analyze the policy-making structure and decision of basic income pilot in global north and global south countries. So we were looking for main origin of the basic income idea, top-down or bottom-up movement. So if it was the government deciding this, or it was coming from the population, for example, civil society. The role of civil society, research design, selection, the planning group, interpretation of the results, financial cost, and fitting the existing social protection system. There were the main aspects that we were looking for. Sample. We interviewed 5 people for each country except for Uganda. That we interviewed 4 people, and that are actively involved in the basic income pilot, so could give us first-hand of information and direct experience. And they are from one of the following categories: politicians, civil society, civil servants, experiment designers, and experiment conductors. And we have been able to interview 1 person per each category for all the countries except Uganda. Participants, each potential participant has been contacted by email between the 8th of February to the 31st of March 2023. The interviewed were 19 participants and 18 were males. About the methodology, we opted about semi-structured interviews. The main reason is with semi-structured interviews, participants choose events to tell about, but researcher decides about ways to explore the story. So there is quite freedom for the interviews, but also the interviewer has the control of discussion. The semi-structured interviews allow to explore participants' thoughts, feelings, and beliefs about a specific topic. They give more freedom to the interview that can ask the participant for clarifications and additional details and explore different aspects. The interview were conducted via Zoom, expected for the Finnish basic income, because I'm based in Helsinki, so I had the opportunity to conduct the interviews face-to-face. The main language was English for Uganda, Netherlands, and Finland, and was Spanish for the members of the Catalan experiment. And of course, all the transcripts have been translated in English after. So, about methodology, semi-structured interviews, how to explore participants' full feelings and beliefs, and the questionnaire had 15 questions. The interviews were conducted via Zoom, and all the material was recorded in Nota software and translated in text, and after analyzed with the Atlas tool. About the discussion results. So the main discussion is the initiative experiment. 3 of the 4 basic income experiments came from a top-down movement. We're talking about Finland, Spain, and Uganda. The analysis indicates that the 2008 economic crisis accelerated the debate on basic income in Finland, Netherlands, and in Spain. Indeed, all the 3 countries even though the debate of basic income was already an historical debate in these countries. Governments started to consider as an option this policy after the economic crisis, as just for boosting the economy or just to give protection to vulnerable people. The basic income experiment in Uganda represents a singular case because it has been promoted and developed by an external actor, so it was not developed by the government. But as I said, that the government, of course, participated and supported the basic income pilot. Source amount of the funds, while Finland and Uganda did not use external funding sources to finance their pilots, Netherlands and Spain did, and especially they used the European Union fundings for this. Some experiments conducted pre-analysis like Finland, where different microsimulation models were run prior to the experiment's launch to advise the government on the best amount of benefit. In this case, microsimulation analysis also had to design a financial neutral basic income pilot for Finland. Quote from one of our interviews from the Dutch experiment says that basic income was already mentioned 60, 70 years ago. When I was a young guy, my father was talking about it. He was a left-wing person. I remember that I said to him that was lunatic and it was not possible to give everybody basic income. But after, of course, during the interview, I must admit that the Dutch government consider and launch this policy, so things change. About the planning group, in each of the 4 basic income experiments, at least one external institution oversaw analyzing the impact of the cash transfer, and local research institutions conducted the experimental evaluation in Finland and in Netherlands, while national institutions and international researchers collaborated with the Spanish basic income experiment, especially many Finnish researchers have been involved in the BB income pilot. Characteristics of experiment and sampling, while in Finland participation in the experiment was mandatory, in the Netherlands, Spain, and Uganda participation was voluntarily. Netherlands and Spain registered difficulties in reaching the right number of participants, while others, Uganda, had problems in finding proper control groups. In this, especially for Uganda, the voice of basic income pilot spread very quickly in the country. So it was difficult for the organization to find a proper control group or saying village with the same population and other characteristics that could be included in the study. Another quote, potential participants were contacted using unofficial government logo and letters. This frequently caused mistrust because such envelopes were typically associated with bad news and people were not opening the letters. Contacting people by phone is attempted by using unknown numbers causes repeats to lose trust. So this was an example of a practical problem that the Dutch experiment and some municipalities had to deal with. About target group and methodology, in Finland and the Netherlands, the recipients were unemployed people, and in Spain, there were the poor households in the specific geographic areas, while in Uganda, the busy village was under study. They tries to condition the benefit to a specific group of people, for example, unemployed, mind the universal aspect. But as we'll see in the conclusion, also was one of the reasons why Finnish experiment used the conditionality aspect to justify the basic income pilot. About my methodology, the main approach used to evaluate the pilots was quantitative. The qualitative approach was primarily used, though in some cases, such as bin income and the basic pilot. So in Spain and Uganda, the researchers and governments opted for a mixed methodology. And in all countries, the length of the experiment represented an important limitation for the interpretation of the results. Quote from one interview of a bin income pilot, because the experiment targeted very vulnerable people that have been for a long time in a situation of poverty and social exclusion, the program had to be of 4 years instead of 2. 4 years was, let's say, the minimum time necessary for these people to get used to having income so they could focus their lives. So also the length of the pilot represented a problem in some cases, like the bin income. Main results and contribution to the UBI debate. All 4 experiments did not evidence any significant positive results on labor supply, and by the registered significant increase in the treatment groups participants' well-being and other spheres. The Dutch experiment did not produce significant results due to the reduced number of participants, while the Finnish one, due to the low numbers of responders. Indeed, in accordance with one of our interviewed, less than 30% of the beneficiaries in the pilot responded to the last question. So there was problem also of data availability. Contribution to the UBI debate, despite using rigorous, primarily quantitative methodologies and producing high-quality results, the debate over UBI remains polarized in politics. And the interpretation of results, however, is frequently influenced by personal beliefs and political calculations. UBI remains a sensitive topic among the population, where especially healthier people are unwilling to pay higher taxes for people who are unemployed or foreigners. And from a quote of an interviewed person of the bin income pilot, he says that some people will see the UBI as something people do not earn. Part of the population will blame another part because they haven't worked and they are lazy. If you go to the doctor, most of the people, they support the public healthcare system. It's a right that you have because you are citizens. But when we talk about basic income, the debate is more polarized, and people do not see it as a support that the government should provide to everyone. So, conclusions. UBI frequently results in the reshaping of basic income experiments into smaller scale programs with specific targeted conditions. There are concerns about the cost and the potential societal impacts of implementing a full-scale UBI and reflective governments and funding institution cohesive approach. This was especially the cause of the Finnish experiment that to justify a basic income pilot that was quite expensive, they opted for some conditionality. So they, for example, target only unemployed people and then focus more on the labor supply response, for example. Of course, reshaping all the concept of basic income experiment. The emphasis on labor supply emerged as a key justification for carrying out the pilots. This provided a compelling argument for gaining support for policymakers and the general public. And the analysis also revealed that the appeal and importance of UBI tend to wane following economic downturns. The short duration of experiments proved to be a significant limitation, is influencing the results in a variety of areas. Indeed, it emerged that 2 years of that was too short time for the analysis of results. UBI in developing countries increasing any interest and attention, and this is expanded, for example, Uganda, but also there are other pilots like, for example, in Republic Democratic of Congo, or also in Kenya, there is more a long-term project. Future research might focus on the long-term effects of the universal basic income and economic and social indicators. I think that the JPAL is running a long-term 10 years basic income pilot in Kenya. led by Banerjee. And also future researchers should investigate the role of the UBI as a tool to respond to shocks and crises caused by climate change or other phenomena. We saw UBI is always considered after economic crisis, and there was important debate in Latin American countries about the CEPAL, for example, on how to use this policy to respond in the short and long term after crisis. And I think that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. I will turn the floor to Sean Christopher Vigil.
Hey everyone, good morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Sean Christopher Vigil, PhD, Applied Ethics at Charles University in Prague. So it's morning time here in Prague, suffering through a massive heat wave, as I'm sure a lot of us are. So trying to stay cool. I've got a fan going. Hopefully that's not too loud in the background. Anyway, I'll begin just like a little bit background. I'm coming from a different background from most of you, as I gather. My background is in philosophy and ethics. So I'm looking at the universal basic income programs from a philosophical perspective, not so much an empirical or scientific one. And my research right now is looking at the ethical features of these basic income programs broadly construed, trying to think about what kind of ethical paradigm, if any, could be used to justify universal basic income programs. So what I'll be presenting to you, let me see if I can share my screen with you one sec. Okay, there we are. It's showing up for you all, yeah? Cool. I think then I go like this. There we are. Okay. Everyone can see my screen all right?
Yes.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you, guys. Sorry, I'm not the most technologically savvy person in the world, I'm going to admit right now. So, right. I'm working through some ideas about like how basic income programs are usually justified. I don't want to patronize the audience. I'm sure you guys are kind of familiar with some of this stuff already, but just so that we're all kind of clear on the background here, you know, there are three main kinds of ethical theories in philosophy that we use to talk about applied ethics. We use, you know, consequentialism, utilitarianism being one of the main ones. We use deontology, which is like a rights-based sort of more abstract sort of philosophical theory. And then there's like virtue ethics, which is one that's based on like character and things like this. It's a little bit more nebulous, I think. And one of the things that's common is that we try to think of like, well, what's well-being, what's flourishing mean under all of these different paradigms. And each one of these paradigms has a different idea of what, you know, flourishing means and looks like. So in the utilitarian consequentialist perspective, we're all pretty much familiar with this because this is where a lot of universal basic income discourse happens. When we talk about the ethics of it, we're looking at consequences, right? We're thinking like, well, how do we maximize utility in the classical economics nomenclature? Like, how do we maximize utility, flourishing, happiness under some description? And we just enact those policies that, you know, accord with that sort of principle. That one's pretty common in like economic sort of discourse. And more political and philosophical discourse, the one that's a little bit more interesting, in my opinion, is the liberal democratic sort of paradigm. And this one's really interesting because it likes to try to present itself in my interpretation as something like a neutral perspective on what we think happiness, well-being, and flourishing looks like. And this is where we have the concept of the good life, which is something that you see come up sometimes in practical philosophy. It's not treated in like extremely formal ways in the literature, But in the modern liberal, egalitarian, democratic paradigm, we like to think that people, are able to make their decisions about what the good life is and how to pursue it and things like this. So for this particular part of my research, I'm looking at the idea of liberalism and the concept of the good life, and if it's an actual feasible sort of idea to use as a guiding principle for deciding whether or not we should endorse programs like basic income programs. So that's the background of this. So to get at this, I just wanted to kind of get clear about the ethics of liberalism. So we're all vaguely familiar with the history of Western thought. We're familiar with like the canon of reason and rationality and freedom and things like this. So I won't pick up the thread super far back in the history, but the one that I'm most interested in is when like liberalism comes into contact with certain kind of evaluative sort of perspectives. And this is where the idea of like neutrality comes in with liberalism. We pick up the narrative somewhere around the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. As we know, the scientific method is characterized by several distinct features, the most important of which for this discussion is objectivity and neutrality. And in like early modern philosophical thinking, they're very seduced by the successes of the scientific method. And we try to sort of model philosophical projects on the scientific methodology around this time. You'll be familiar with thinkers like Descartes, for example, using his method of radical skepticism. This is just common sort of strategy when you're philosophizing back in this time. The paradigmatic figure here is Kant, Immanuel Kant, 18th century German philosopher. I'm sure you are all familiar with him. His ethical theory, I think, is pretty exemplary of the marriage of this liberal philosophy and the scientific sort of enterprise, because if you know anything about Kantian ethics, it's a deontological ethics. It's a rights-based ethics, like I was mentioning before. His main strategy is to try to abstract from conditionality, right? We think when we're trying to think of what a moral duty is, a maxim by which we act, what we are meant to do is try to take away all personality from the consideration, and we try to imagine like what would be a true or a valid moral maxim for any rational agent as such. Doesn't matter about my personal inclinations, doesn't matter about my happiness, doesn't matter about the fortuity of the outcomes. What counts as good is what refers to the principle of reason that stands over and above individuality, over and above conditions and things like this. So his whole method, his whole strategy is this idea of impartiality, impersonality. He's trying to sort of filter the subjectivity from his moral theory. And I say that sort of in a sort of cautious manner, because he doesn't do away with the subject entirely in the metaphysical sense. And he's certainly not unconcerned with the subject. But when you're building an ethical theory under this kind of paradigm, what you're really trying to do is try to get something objective, something impersonal, something impartial. And Kant is the one who has influenced philosophy and political thinking a lot ever since the Enlightenment. When we think of like post-Enlightenment, like modern and postmodern thinking, especially in the political realm, this is the kind of thinking that we're talking about. And we can see this as evidence through modern political theorizing. Neo-Kantian sort of theorists are pretty typical. It's actually almost, I would say, this kind of liberal sort of sensibility is almost second nature to our modern political systems and structures. So you might be familiar with John Rawls. I mean, probably he's one of the 20th century's largest political thinkers. if like some brief key main ideas about Rawls. I'm not gonna go into the details about like the arguments and his theory. It's more the methodology that I'm interested in here. So you might know something about his idea of justice as fairness, and the way that he talks about justice is trying to imagine an ideal agent, an ideal society, ideal constitution based on, you know, sort of ideas that would be true to an impartial observer, right? One of these ideas is like the difference principle and the veil of ignorance. To remind us what that kind of thought experiment and idea was, it's just the idea of if we're thinking about a society that we'd want to build, what kind of constitution we would want and what sort of policies we would endorse, the way that we would arrive at some sort of system that all reasonable agents could agree to would be to imagine ourselves behind a veil of ignorance, not knowing certain, actually any details about our particular conditions, and think, well, what sort of policy would we endorse in that case? The difference principle, you know, is trying to make the least well-off people in the as well off as possible under any potential proposal, right, in policy. So however that works out, it's not super important, but what's really important is this methodology, right? It's the same thing that we see in Kantian ethics. It's the same thing we see in the scientific method. It's a matter of abstraction, right? It's a matter of trying to imagine what the ideal sort of agent looks like, what the ideal sort of constitution, institutions, systems, policies would look like if we think about it in a completely detached, purely rational sort of way, right? And just to demonstrate that this isn't just like, you know, creating like a straw man or grasping at straws here in this treatment, we see this in the universal basic income discourse quite a lot. Whenever we think about justifications of universal basic income, advocates like liberalism, obviously, they want to maximize liberalism, they want to maximize liberty under some description, which is, you know, freedom to choose what the good life is for you and how to pursue it and so on. And, you know, a pretty good representative of this, I think, is Van Parijs and Van der Voort, which I'm sure you're all familiar with their work in their 2017 book, Basic Income. Actually, the subtitle is How to Create a Free and Sane Society, right? A nice quote from them. They've written that the shaping of our social institutions should not be guided by a specific concept or conception of the good life, but by a coherent and plausible conception of justice. So this is demonstrating or representative of the attitude that we usually have when we're thinking about universal basic income and its relationship to ethics and a relationship to a certain political ideology, namely liberalism, is that if we're going to try to justify a basic income program, we should try to remain neutral on the good life, because in the name of liberty, people should be able to, you know, or should be free to choose the kind of lives they want to live and how to pursue the ends that they determine worthwhile and so on. All sounds really good. I think it sounds pretty agreeable to our modern sensibilities and liberal democratic societies and things like this. And for what it's worth, it might be true. In the research that I've done on basic income, like justifications for those sorts of programs, this is probably one of the most common ones, along with like some sort of classical economics sort of treatment by which we think like, well, look at the types of impacts it could potentially have, look at the projections from the research that we have on the pilot programs, all seem really promising. Maybe on a consequentialist ethic, that could be basic income could be justified. It's contingent, though, for sure. It's contingent on whether or not those outcomes actually would obtain, right? In liberalism, it's no less contingent, I would like to say, because what we're trying to say is like, we would endorse a basic income only in case it accords with our liberal principles and ideologies, namely that if we embrace or if we advocate a basic income program, it would be a program that maximizes liberty in particular. And as long as the program does maximize liberty under some description, then we will endorse it. Obviously, the problem is the conditionality, right? If the basic income program doesn't maximize liberalism or liberty under any description, then we have a problem trying to justify basic income on liberalistic paradigms, right? So I'm trying to make a case here where it's like liberalism itself is not as neutral as it likes to think. And so when it thinks of like, okay, well, how are we going to justify ourselves? Well, we got to make some reference to what we think the good life or good conditions would be in order to justify this. So I'm trying to think that liberalism, our liberty, the value of liberty and liberalism as an ideology itself, maybe is not enough to justify basic income programs. So how do we actually get around or kind of find some inroads to critiquing this liberal sensibility that we have? Well, we have some historical precedent too. I, again, won't get into too much of the details here, but say counter-Enlightenment thinking happened almost contemporaneously with Enlightenment thinking. There were certain movements, obviously, that were reactive to the Enlightenment thinking, that were unsatisfied with this, say, faith in reason, this prioritizing of rationality, and things like this. We see this like in the Sturm und Drang movement that was in the 70s and 80s and the 1700s. We see this obviously canonically as Romanticism reacting against Enlightenment thinking, and not reacting in like a super like you know, I guess radical sense, because obviously they had some sympathies for the Enlightenment values and like critique and things like this. But there were still you know, some sort of counter-Enlightenment sensibilities happening even during the Enlightenment, right? But we'll pick up the thread somewhere in like the 19th century, where the germ of this like attack on say the monolith of the scientific enterprise begins, I mean, in lots of places, but I think probably the paradigmatic figure to focus on here is Nietzsche. Obviously one of the most popular philosophers in the history, right? And he's, you know, following under the influence of like Schopenhauer and Wagner in the arts. He's one of the early figures that starts really taking the Enlightenment to task and actually pointing the finger at it as, you know, the culprit of a lot of what he saw to be the decay of value in Western civilization, right? So a couple of his key works here where this is relevant is like the early work, The Birth of Tragedy, his first published manuscript, and the Untimely Meditations that came shortly thereafter. One of the like basic ideas here in early like Nietzsche's early thought was that this sort of monolith of like reason and rationality and scientific thinking was really at the inception of Western thinking in ancient Greece. He used the beautiful metaphor of like the Apollonian sort of energy and the Dionysian energy from the Greek, you know, mythical figures, their gods, symbolizing one, the more like apodictic, discrete sort of rational tendencies, and the other one, the more free and sort of chaotic in a non-pejorative sense, the creative sort of spirit in the second sort of sense. And he thinks that like rationality was obviously the one that's won out the narrative, and it's the one that, you know, we have been using in philosophizing ever since the ancient Greeks. And he thinks that this is a problem because it actually creates a vacuum of value. And, you know, there are lots, obviously, there's tons of literature on Nietzsche, but he does at least want to sort of make a way to, you know, try to, how to say, truly liberate humanity through this sort of more free and creative artistic enterprise almost. He writes in one of his untimely meditations, the third untimely meditation, in fact, says our schools and teachers simply abstain from an education in morality or make do with mere formalities and virtues. A word no longer means anything. So he laments that the Western civilization in the 19th century, at the time of his writing, seems to be in decay, and it's precisely because of this rationalistic sort of scientific ethos that we've been using. And his influence follows through a lot of what we say like modern or postmodern thinking. And I think it was developed pretty well in the 20th century by the critical theory, the Frankfurt School. Some of you will be familiar with them also. You know, they have that movement's pretty interesting too, but I take as the representative figures for this on their critique of the Enlightenment, Horkheimer and Adorno. One of the canonical texts from critical theory is the Dialectic of Enlightenment, and they're working on like a sort of like Hegelian, Marxist, Nietzschean basis, and their attack on reason and scientism, we will say, right, picks up where Nietzsche sort of left off, right? And they want to talk about ideas of like alienation, about reification. Briefly, that means like alienation is like some sort of like distancing from, you know, the objects of your production, and also ultimately distancing from yourself, losing a sense of individuality, becoming something more like an automaton, you know, not really having any connection with the world that you inhabit and the kind of person you are, basically stripping away your individuality. And this is a consequence of these sorts of systems that are erected on Enlightenment ideals, right? Reification, just to have a definition out there, is the process of making like a thing, right? Making things become objects. And under what Horkheimer and Adorno charge, under these sorts of Enlightenment values, under the sorts of mechanistic sort of tendencies in economic systems, their target was capitalistic production. Everything becomes commodified, everything becomes reified. That's not just the objects of our labor, but also ourselves. We become alienated from ourselves. And this is all a consequence of Enlightenment values and Enlightenment thinking. This is the supposed objectivity, this supposed rationality that was supposed to liberate us, actually creates us, makes us become like automatons. We're not free, paradoxically, under the sort of tendencies that are meant to support theory, like the paradigm, like the liberal paradigm that we sketched out before. So suddenly the underpinnings of the liberal framework start to come into question in the 19th and 20th centuries. If it's true that we're losing some grounds for justifying our using some sort of liberal ethic to justify our moral intuitions, then we're probably going to have to look somewhere else, right? And so where I'm kind of at in my research is trying to look at maybe alternatives that haven't been like avenues that we can use to try to justify the sorts of policies like basic income programs without reference to like liberal principles or consequentialist principles, right? And the way that I propose that we do this is to maybe just like accept this, right? This critique of Enlightenment values, about liberal ideologies, and like let's look at exactly what kind of people we actually are and what sort of intuitions we have and how we might justify those sorts of things. So I'm looking for an alternative ontology and morality, and there are plenty of modern contemporary options here. My proposal is to look at two things, which is moral psychology, because we have the benefit of modern psychological science at our disposal, and also a sort of phenomenology or hermeneutic that's inspired by the early 20th century, well, phenomenologists and existentialists, right? So the first inroad that we have to sort of loosen our I guess, fidelity to liberalism and scientific methodology is this. Maybe not reason, but maybe emotion, right? Emotion and passion has been the historical antithesis of reason and rationality. What we know from moral psychology is that we are irrational beings, we're emotional beings. We routinely make decisions based on our emotions and our other irrational features. So we grant that, and maybe we can build some sort of ethic on top of that. We also grant that we are socially embedded beings, and this comes largely from the work earlier Hegelians and Marxists, but it's really, I think, formulated probably most sophisticatedly in the early Heidegger's work. And Being in Time in the 1920s, he comes up with this idea of being in the world as a fundamental condition of humans. Say humans. I mean, he uses a technical term called Dasein, but broadly construed something like human subjects existing in a world and acting in a world. We're socially embedded, is to say. He uses this concept, Befindlichkeit and Stimmung, to talk about the way that we feel being in this particular condition. And so we make a philosophical connection from the way that we feel, having a mood, being in the world, to the moral psychology of actual emotions, emotional states, and decision-making procedures that we make therein. So those are
Sean Christopher, I'm so sorry. You can't see the chat. I just want to let you know we're at past the 20-minute mark. If you want to, if you have feedback to get to, I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Oh, okay. No, I didn't see the chat box. I'm sorry, in the full screen mode. Okay, well, maybe, okay. Maybe, hopefully this all sounds kind of plausible. You see where I'm going. I'll wrap up here for the sake of time. I know we have like question and answer sort of things. So I'll be happy to answer any questions and like wrap things up if people are curious to see where I was going with this. So sorry about going over, and thank you for your patience, everybody. Thanks.
No worries. I know it's hard to talk about anything in philosophy in 15 minutes. So we were asked to stop on 75 minutes to make room for the next group to come in, but does anyone have a quick 1 or 2 questions for speakers? Yeah, Franziska.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the presentation. And actually, I would like to come back to Lisa's presentation in the very beginning, and which I was listening to you, I was very much reminded of some of the work I am doing or have been doing in the Kyrgyz Republic. I did a lot of work in Eastern Europe, let's say, and when I think, no, how should I say it? I think your analysis focuses on migrants from Eastern Europe, right? So to some extent, the findings that you have for me are totally not surprising, yes, because it is, we looked, for example, in Central Asia at the preferences for redistribution, different attitudes towards the poor and things like that, totally different context. But it is very similar to, in a way, to what you presented. And I think that a big part of the explanation also is the heritage where they're coming from. It is this post-socialist society. And also, I think I only remember one where I think the age was 58. So distract 30 years. They are 28 at the time of independence in these countries. So these people have experienced, let's say, the socialist economies, yes, and also the different paradigms that were active then. So poverty did not exist, for example, and everybody was supposed to contribute. So I just think it would be very interesting if you could, let's say, repeat your analyses with a different group of migrants, which have a different background, right? And to see whether they actually have the same understanding. That's all. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, in a way, we haven't done a similar analysis with a different group of migrants, but as I mentioned, I normally do work in South Africa where I do ask similar questions and I actually hear quite similar responses, which is interesting. But I do think you're absolutely right. And in particular, I'm really intrigued by this kind of trope that we heard a lot of: you can always sweep the streets or you can always wash the buses, which was kind of unique to, like, that I don't hear in well, actually sweeping the street I hear a bit in South Africa, but I do wonder if that was kind of part of the kind of, post-socialist imaginary of, like, the state will always give you this kind of cleaning job in a public space, worst case, which, I mean, in the UK, you can't always just sweep the streets or wash the buses. Like, that isn't an easily available job that anyone can get, right? So it was kind of an interesting thing that people kept falling back on. Absolutely. Could I ask a question?
I thought it was really interesting. Oh yeah. I just wanted to piggyback on that, and then, but I thought it was really interesting that that they thought that someone should be hired to supervise this woman sweeping. So we should pay 2 people to make sure that woman wasn't being idle. That was so fascinating. Anyway, sorry, I'll toss it to you.
I wanted to ask Franziska a question about the survey, and this is kind of a boring question maybe, and I just missed it, but I was interested in the role of class or income in your respondents. So I didn't see it as one of the original kind of variables that you controlled for, but maybe I missed it. But then I know that, like, self-interest or being poor oneself was one of your kind of factors. So I'm just curious how, how it's something I've done a little bit of survey research myself in South Africa, and it's something that we've really struggled with in survey design, is how to get at people's income and class, the kind of question to ask, and then kind of how you factored that into your results. So that's one question. The other also kind of boring question is, you said you talked a lot about conditionality, but I'm curious what conditions, what conditions did you propose that people were in favor of?
Thanks, Liz, for the question. I mean, with that, at least with respect to the income status, poverty status, we rely here really on a subjective question, whether people are able to make ends meet and how difficult it is. So this was not, these people were interviewed on the street, so it was as such not possible really to have a very broad income module and things like that. It was more this question, the subjective, let's say, poverty question. As for conditionality, we didn't say anything specific. We just said it is a behavioral condition. So we did not say going to the traditional conditions like going to school or being, in a sub-Saharan African context to taking care of your health or even work or something like that. No, we did not specify anything of that. Which is also a limitation, you know how this goes. You have your survey and then you start analyzing the results and it's like, why on earth didn't we ask this? Why didn't we ask this? But it is what it is.
Thanks so much. And I see Sean Christopher's hand up.
Yeah, so I had a question for Dr. Fouksman. And I hope I didn't miss it in your presentation. But you did mention that in some of your surveys, after you interacted with your participants, they kind of changed their attitudes sometimes. I was wondering how their attitudes actually were changed, what happened in those dialogues where you saw attitudes changing.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the, fruitful, but also kind of difficult things about doing qualitative research and in-depth interviews is, it is a two-way conversation. And these interviews really were set up as two-way conversations. So we weren't trying to convince anyone of anything. We just asked lots of follow-up questions. And sometimes when you probe at people's kind of economic intuitions through a series of follow-up questions, they start to see kind of cracks in their own logic. So then they might go back. And also, I just think, people's views aren't consistent within themselves, also based particularly around topics that maybe they haven't thought a lot about. So people would start off saying that you can't get money for nothing, but then would kind of halfway through, especially when we asked them to think about themselves, would think, well, maybe actually it would be a good thing, but then we kind of flip back again. And you could see a lot of this kind of internal tussle, which I think is really interesting. Yeah. But I think it was really the follow-up questions, kind of probing out where these intuitions were coming from, that made people go a bit like, oh, in both directions, actually.
Yeah, were there like specific questions you saw people like starting to turn around, or?
Well, for instance, if people said, getting money for nothing makes people lazy, and then you say, well, what about you? Imagine yourself getting a basic income. Do you think you'll be lazy? And most people would say no, and then would start thinking, well, maybe. But some people are really attached to this idea of the lazy other, and other people kind of let it go. And then sometimes you see people then kind of using these kind of racialized tropes of, well, I won't be lazy, but this other group of people will be lazy as well. But yeah, sometimes people would change their minds. Sometimes it would go the other way, where people would start off in support of basic income and then start talking through it and start thinking, oh, actually, it'll be too expensive now that I think about it, or actually, no, people will stop working. So it would go in the other direction as well.
That's super interesting. Thanks for
Okay,
sharing.
well, okay, it's my job to tell us we have to wrap up before they kick us out. A very fascinating presentation. Lovely to meet all of you. Have a wonderful conference. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Mm.